Hello everyone, my name's Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the BT15 meta. Well, I know the BT15 meta isn't exactly over with, but we do have lots of data to be able to look at, break down, and infer where the current state of the BT15 meta is and the direction it's currently headed in. So as far as where I generally like to start, I always like to start with taking a look at, well, Japanese data, because usually we're picking up where Japan left off. Except this time around, BT15 in Japan, their metadata is for the most part irrelevant to us because we're playing with a completely different rule set compared to what they were playing with. So they had Apocalypmon, Anubismon, and Melga all unrestricted, running an absolute muck, and, well, those were the top 3 decks of their format. And because those were the top 3 decks of their format, theirs was, well, shaped and molded around those decks and those decks' capabilities. But when we got the ban and restricted list update for the English format to neuter those decks' capabilities, they weren't as threatening or basically a threat at all, which created a power vacuum that we didn't exactly know what was going to end up filling those gaps. So what does the meta actually look like? Before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the data, let me just say that this format is actually a pretty wide and diverse format. It kind of follows the similar trends that we've seen in other wide formats before, like BT13 and BT14, where if anyone's unfamiliar or doesn't remember, BT13 had 22 different decks make it into top 16, and the leading deck was only at about 26% in terms of all of the represented decks in those top 16s. Then BT14 had 24 different decks, with the leader of the pack only being about 16%. So right now with the BT15, we have about 24 different decks that were actually able to make it into top 16, being very similar again to BT13 and BT14. So while it's really nice that we're able to see lots of decks top, it does make preparing for events a little bit harder because we have that much more to worry about, but the reality is that there's actually only a select small few decks that are able to top consistently, really making up the bulk of the meta. So as far as what the meta actually looks like and, well, the data that we have so far, I just threw it into an Excel spreadsheet and you could kind of see this timeline of events on what was able to top, how many decks were able to top in that event, and all of the different events that we had so far. So if I take that type of data and I condense it down to, well, actual more harder and concrete numbers, we could kind of see something like what we have on the right with all of the different decks, how many of the different decks, and the percentage against each other. So the represented percentage only counts towards the decks that appeared in top 16. If a deck didn't hit top 16, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not competitively viable, it just means it has yet to prove itself to actually be competitively viable. But we can see based on this data that right now Numemon is the leader of the pack. He is currently the best deck, but it's not like he's leading by that wide of a margin. So currently it is on the incline, as we saw with our timeline, that he was able to top consistently, and he's been topping more and more, but there's still a lot left to BT15, and maybe somebody's going to discover something that is going to end up changing things. As far as where the rest of the meta goes, we could see that about 9 out of the 24 decks had only 1 win to them, which means that those decks really just got lucky in terms of their competitive success. Not trying to discredit the players on those decks that were able to top with those one-ofs, it's just they didn't have any repeated success, so those are just more one-of standouts rather than something that's actually good enough to compete and to take multiple tops multiple times. So looking at this, we can really just narrow it down to about 8 or 9 decks that are actually making up the bulk of the meta, topping consistently. So that just brings us to what are the top 8 decks of the BT15 meta. Well, it's pretty easy to see based on the information that we had from the data that we're able to pull that Numemon is number 1, Red Hybrids is number 2, Leviamon is number 3, Mirage is number 4, Deva's Fanglong or Four Sovereigns is number 5, Lugamon is number 6, Shinegreymons number 7, and Yellow Vaccines is number 8. So a lot of these decks are actually decks we've seen for a while now, and there's a good reason why. With the limitations made to Anubis, Melga, and Apocalypse, it made it harder for those decks to perform like they did in Japan, and in Japan, those were the cornerstones that was shaping their meta. With a lot of BT15 actually kind of being underpowered if you look at it in a vacuum, it didn't really leave us with a whole lot of new parts, pieces, tools, and decks to play around with it that were able to compete with what we already had, leaving only a few decks to finish and be completed, or just a couple of cards to enhance their already existing game plans, thanks to what BT15 was offering, and some of those were actually good enough to be able to break into the meta and be really dominant, as well as the inclusion of the Double Typhoon Advanced deck as another key piece in difference to our format versus Japan's on how certain things are performing. So taking a look at the top 5 decks a little bit more specifically, because I think the top 5 decks are painting a pretty good picture as far as why the meta is shaping out the way it is, starting off with the big leader, which is Numemon. So Numemon is just an incredibly hard deck for a lot of other matchups to be able to deal with, because it kind of covers every single base. It doesn't necessarily need protection because it could just float bodies. It has really good tempo thanks to lots of ability to gain memory on a lot of its cards, on top of the fact that it has both good control and aggression thanks to whatever top end and whatever low end that you're going to be utilizing, as well as Ukamon to kind of just tie the whole deck together to turbo out your raising area for whatever various purposes that you need it to do. Then the new cards like Monzemon X and Numemon X really are the key center points on why the deck is functioning and working the way it is, because you have Numemon X that's able to bring out the Platinum, which allows you to bring out a Monzemon when it dies, as well as gaining memory potentially when Platinum even comes onto the field, making it a very easy card to be able to just go into and keep a board presence at any stage of the game, while Monzemon X is adding even more removal just because it lets you play another body for free, adding to the overall swarm potential that the deck has, on top of the fact that it's just going to be DP minusing, which you could combine with some of your other DP minus effects to further control the field, as well as just being able to customize whatever level 6s and 7s you're supplementing the deck with on the top end to further aggro or control, as well as customizing whatever low end you want, because none of it actually matters, because you're just going to be hard playing your Numemons anyway most of the time, and that's kind of just how the deck is functioning, and what is making it so successful is just the sheer difficulty on how to tackle everything that the deck has, while being able to do basically anything and everything compared to a lot of other decks. Then that brings us to Red Hybrids. So Red Hybrids really hasn't changed a whole lot. We just started teching the deck a little bit more to, well, handle what the meta is currently throwing at us. So right now we do know that just dealing really big damage and being hyper aggressive is just a good strategy, and Emperor Greymon is just one of the better cards at doing that, while also being safe and hitting high enough DP thresholds to not really matter about what the opponent is trying to do. We're maximizing on our Ukamons to be able to turbo out our raising area even more to try to match the aggression of Numemon, and we're even teching cards like Crimson Blaze to be able to try to out the Numemons with a really good option removal Floodgates. Then when it comes to Leviamon is another deck that has lots of different capabilities on what it can do, both aggressively and defensively. The fact that it has some really good removal options makes it a really devastating force against a lot of other matchups because they could just hit one of the security bombs and the game can kind of just end from there. But you also do have some really good combo potential between the X antibody and Leviamon X, where if you use it with a level 5, you could get a free evo into the Leviamon X, or you could just try to sit back and play a control game where you're just trying to set up your Biting Crush, delete the opponent's big threats, and bring one threat out yourself. So it's just another very well-rounded deck that has lots of capabilities on what it could potentially do. Then when it comes to Mirage, well, the one thing that Numemon, Red Hybrids, and Leviamon kind of have in common is the fact that they want to have on-delete effects and they're trying to take advantage of their trash, and, well, if you deny them cards from their trash and get rid of the bodies without deleting them, it kind of leaves them in a really bad spot and situation that this type of a deck can take advantage of, especially if you are able to set up an early game Mirage. He could kind of just floodgate the opponent out because of his anti-tempo taxing ability for the opponent trying to draw into their pieces, and that could really put them off of their game plan, while you also have the capabilities of being, well, an OTK-based deck, where you're just going to sit there, do nothing, play your trainings and boosts, and try to set up your one big stack to move out and combo and kill the opponent in a single turn. And that kind of leaves Divas in a really good position to kind of be a solid defensive deck in the format, because you have something like Red Hybrids and Numemon, again, being really aggressive decks that are trying to swing with your lower bodies, which means that they're not going to be able to remove your higher level bodies as efficiently, so you could just sit on your level 5s, wait for them to aggress, and then ace and punish them. And you have lots of really powerful ace Digimon that are able to control the opponent's field, as well as a big boss monster that's also just really hard to get rid of when he comes out. So now that we know what is doing well and why it's doing well, what actually ended up winning their respective events? So out of the 8 events that we had so far, in the first core TCG event, Red Hybrids ended up taking the W. In the Raid and Trade Regional, we had Gallantmon win. In TAC Sydney, we had Divas and Fanglong won. In the Nest Latin America, we had Mirage Galgamon won. In the Mana Vortex Regional, we had Mirage take another win. In the Play TCG in-person regional, we had Numemon win. In the Core April Regional, we had Numemon win. And in the Play Online Ultimate Cup, we had Yellow Vaccine take the win. So literally outside of Gallantmon, each of those decks are represented in the top 8 decks of the format, to no one's surprise. So if anyone's actually curious if I were to put these into like an arbitrary tier list, this is kind of the tier list I would generally go with and what it would kind of look like. So why is this important to know? Knowing what the top decks are, how they're being played, and what's comprising their success helps you better understand what tech cards we could fit inside of our decks to try to better counteract those top decks to give us that extra edge. So in conclusion, BT15 as a meta might look healthy with a solid number of strong decks being able to top, but the reality is that most of those decks kind of did just end up getting lucky, and about 80% of the meta is dominated by, well, the top 8 decks that I've already shown that are proven to have consistent and repeated success. Looking at all of the decks, we could kind of see a pattern on their overall success, which is the use of Ukamon, use of training cards, and use of Ace Digimon. So while none of these things are necessarily bad, it does go to highlight the shift in the game due to their overall presence. I don't necessarily think wide formats are that bad, but knowing what to focus on and what to try to include your tech for is going to be the hardest part, and hopefully this is to help you better understand what is actually going on in the meta. So we still do have a good number of events in BT15 left, so hopefully this helps you for the rest of the meta find your own competitive success.